director of the center. Really glad to see you all. Some people on Zoom, some people in the room huddling together over there for warmth. I guess I'm on my own up here with the speaker, but that's okay. So today our speaker is Professor Dennis Halpin, who's an associate professor in the history department. And he specializes in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, African-American history, labor history. He's the author of a book on Black Reconstruction and its legacies in Baltimore. And he's now working on a new book, which I think he's going to tell us about today. And it looks as though he's going to ask for maybe our help in solving a narrative dilemma regarding the cases of Jefferson Davis and Henry Jones. Over to you, Dr. Halpin. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me okay? Ooh. Maybe a little too well? Is that better? Yeah. That's good. Okay. Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the Center of Humanities for providing this venue to share our research. And of course, thank you all for coming. Today, I'm going to present an overview of my second book project, tentatively titled Bloodstained Rocks, although I'm not at all wedded to this title, Navassa and the Human Legacies of the Guano Islands Act. And as Paul mentioned, I'm hoping to use this session both to gather general feedback from you all, but also in particular on a narrative issue that I've been wrestling with as the book begins to take shape. So I'm grateful for any feedback that you can share on that or any feedback that you can share about the project in general. I'd be very grateful. So before discussing the narrative struggle that I'm having, I first wanted to provide a bit of an overview about the book and then introduce Henry Jones and Jeff Davis. And I'm sorry for the Civil War historians, the Jeff Davis in question is not the ex-Confederate President Jefferson Davis, but rather another man that I find to be a little bit more interesting. Finding a way to narrate their lives together is that a challenge that I'm having, and I'll talk more specifically about that as I go along here. The first thing that we should talk about is the island itself, which serves both as the book's primary setting, or at least the setting that anchors the rest of the book. Navassa sits between Jamaica and Haiti. It's roughly about 40 miles off the extreme western coast of Haiti. It's an island that is uninhabited and uninhabitable due to a lack of fresh water and a relative lack of accessibility. So this is an 1873 painting of the island. And one of the things you can see is that it's kind of difficult to get onto the island itself. The company that ends up owning and governing the island uses kind of a series of lifts and slides to get people and phosphates on and off of the island and supplies on and off of the islands. Haiti has historical claims to the islands, with roots reaching back to the eras of Spanish and then French colonization prior to the Haitian Revolution. These claims have been affirmed in numerous documents both before and after its revolution. So I'll put up a couple of slides here. I'll talk a little bit more about Benjamin C. Clark, and just a little bit the author of this, but he kind of nicely and succinctly summarizes the claims that Haiti has to the island. Benjamin Clark, this is in the days before the United States recognized Haiti as a nation, and so the way that the United States interacted with Haiti was through the use of these guys that were called commercial agents, mostly businessmen, kind of lower level diplomats in the United States, and Benjamin Clark is one of those men. So in the first half of the 19th century, most people in the United States were unaware of Navassa, but interest in the island begins to intensify in the mid-19th century. So Clark lays out all of these different claims that Haiti has and then surmises at the end the island of Navassa was therefore seen to be as much a part and parcel of Haiti as the island of Nantucket of this union. The United States will not see things in this way when a couple of businessmen are going to end up making claims on Navassa. So in the mid-19th century, people suddenly become interested in the island, not because of the island itself, but rather what's on the island. Due to soil exhaustion, farmers in the mid-Atlantic increasingly sought guano to fertilize their fields. Farmers, agricultural periodicals, agricultural groups pressed the government, the US government, to find an alternative to Peruvian guano, which was at the time the primary source of fertilizer in the mid-19th century, but one that had some problems. It was both expensive and in short supply, Peru sent most of its guano to Britain, not to the United States. So after years of agitation and a couple of failed efforts by other entrepreneurs to temporarily claim other guano islands, the United States passes the 1856 Guano Islands Act. I won't talk about it in depth, but in short, what the Guano Islands Act did was it allowed any U.S. entrepreneur with the resources to temporarily claim an island that had guano until they mined its resources off of the island. It gets a little confusing at this point because Navassa actually does not contain very much guano, or a great quantity of guano, I should say. Instead, it had large phosphate deposits that manufacturers combined with guano, sometimes with sulfuric acid, to make a fertilizer, what people referred to at the time and you would see marketed as manipulated guano or superphosphates during the era. So these are a couple of ads that you would see for manipulated guano, and so they're mixing up some of the phosphates that are coming off of Navassa with various other things to make it work as a fertilizer. In 1857, a Baltimore-based captain by the name of Peter Duncan claimed Navassa in the name of his employers, a father and son duo, Edward Oakes and Edward Kernan Cooper, using the provisions of the Guano Islands Act. And with the federal government's sanction, the Coopers stole Navassa from Haiti over Haitian objections. It was the first grant under the Guano Islands Act, and Navassa became the United States' first overseas possession. In 1864, Edward O., the father by this point had passed away, sold the rights to Navassa to a New York-based company, the Navassa Phosphate Company, who effectively governed the island until 1898. And for various reasons, the company kind of goes bankrupt at that point. But during that time, during the 40 or so years that the company governed the islands, they employed black workers, mainly from the United States, but also from around kind of the Black Atlantic, to mine the island under truly horrific conditions. To the extent that people know anything about Navassa to this day, it's most likely because of events in 1889. During September of 1889, company officials attacked their workforce, and in the ensuing violence, the black workers, who greatly outnumbered the white officers, so at any given time, there would be somewhere between 10 and 15 white officers on the island, and then somewhere between 100 and 200 black workers on the island at any given moment. During this time, there were 140 black workers and 11 white officers on the island. Black workers killed 5 white officers. The event and the ensuing trials that took place in the United States were reported throughout the world and received extensive coverage in newspapers. It's the signal event in the island's history. It is also where I first met, I should have put this up sooner, but you can see some of the ways that the newspapers are reporting the Navassa violence at this time. At first, they're very much blaming the black workers for what happened. Over time, their understanding becomes a little bit more nuanced, but they still largely blame black workers for what happened on Navassa during this time. So the 1889 violence is where I met Henry Jones as well. So Henry Jones was initially given a death sentence, but Benjamin Harrison, the president at the time, commuted his sentence to life, and Henry will be incarcerated at Kings County Penitentiary in Brooklyn. During his incarceration, Henry continued to fight to clear his name. He entered prison illiterate. He learns to read and write in prison, where he worked through the U.S. Pardon Attorney's office to obtain a pardon. So pardon attorney, I came to find out, can be both a person, sometimes he was writing to a pardon attorney, but it also is an office in the federal government that handles presidential pardon efforts. Luckily for me, the pardons attorney's office preserved everything that they had about Henry Jones. His file is about 300 pages thick. It includes letters that he wrote, notes from his defense team, a letter from his mother. There's petitions that various activists had undertaken to try to free him. All of these things offered clues to Henry's life. And one of the problems that I have found in trying to learn more about the men that work this island is they have really incredible names. And then when you couple that with the fact that young, working class, illiterate black men do not have a large presence in the archives, it was really difficult to find anything about any of these people. And specifically, the pardon case file gives me a way in to Henry's life. So based upon the clues that was in his pardon case and also his prison file in Atlanta, where he eventually will be transferred, I found other documents about Jones's life. He was born in Pocomoke City, Maryland, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland, sometime in the 1860s. He gave various dates for his birth over the years, but I've ruled some of them out based upon what I know about his parents, Henry and Louisa Jones. So Henry Sr., I know very little about. He died serving in the Union Army, likely before his son was born. I found very, very little about Henry Sr. or that side of his family, and I know it's probably difficult to read these, but Louisa Jones, widow of Henry Jones, alias Henry Parker, served as a private, and then down here, it gives her address, which was a godsend for me because I did not have her address. I was able to find her in census records based upon this address. And it notes that he was killed. So what she was doing was she was filing paperwork to get a pension for Henry Sr. in Henry Sr.'s name. Well, like I said, I found very, very little about that side of the family. I know more about his mother's side of the family. Louisa had a sister, Mary, who married somebody named Wesley Kersey. Louisa and Mary's mother was named Milky, and their father was named Daniel. Shortly after Henry Sr.'s death, Louisa made the difficult decision to move to Baltimore as a single mother with her infant son in tow. Henry grows up in Reconstruction-era Baltimore, raised by a single mother who worked as a domestic laborer. It was an occupation that many black women were forced into due to a lack of opportunities in the wake of slavery. It's unclear if Henry had much schooling. He was illiterate by the time he goes to Navassa. I know a little bit more about their lives before he went to Navassa in 1883. Both Henry and Louisa get arrested. Henry for allegedly stealing cloth from a store that he worked at, and his mother for harboring the cloth. Both will end up serving about a year and a half in the Maryland Penitentiary at this time. And after prison, Henry gets out and he begins working as a waiter, where he meets a recruiter for the Navassa Phosphate Company. Based on the lies, and I can talk about this more in depth in a little bit, but recruiters constantly sold potential workers on the idea that they were going to a Caribbean paradise. Based upon this, Henry decides to go to Navassa. The decision will change his life. During the violence in 1889, Henry, by his own admission, struck one of the white bosses on the island who later died. When Henry left the man, he claimed that he was still alive. A later autopsy determined that the man may have died from numerous injuries he had sustained that day, but Henry gets blamed for the murder, and that's what he ends up getting convicted of. Henry, it should be pointed out, was steadfast throughout his life that he acted in self-defense, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He dies in 1911, trying to clear his name over what happened in Navassa. So in his life, Henry was a litigant in a Supreme Court case. His life helps illuminate some lesser-known foot soldiers in the fight for civil rights, in particular. So this is a letter from Samuel R. Scottron, who was an entrepreneur and activist up in New York City His lasting legacy is he invented the curtain rod. But he also was an activist at this time who has not gotten a lot of play, and his records and the efforts that he takes to free Henry show up pretty clearly in some of the records in the pardon files. So it gives me a chance to write about some of these folks as well that have not gotten a lot of say in our historical stories about civil rights, especially during this period. Other activists, Booker T. Washington, T. Thomas Fortune, probably the most famous of the activists that are going to lend their names to Henry's cause in the late 1890s and early 1900s. And when their efforts failed, Henry became one of the first federal prisoners transferred to the then newly opened and not yet quite ready to be occupied Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So when I found details about Henry's life in the National Archives, I was stunned. I have known about the Navassa story some from the earliest days of researching my dissertation. So this is like 2008, 2009 when I came across this story. And I wrote a little bit about it in the book, but from the point of view of activists that had defended some of the workers. And I always wanted to go back and understand a little bit more about the workers that were there, but the problem was finding information about them. And Henry's life really just opened up for me when I found the sources at the National Archives. Up to that point, I had largely given up on finding any kind of biographical details about any of these individuals. So when I came across Henry's file, like November of 2022 or December of 2022, I had decided to write a book that was going to center Henry's life and experience. And what drew me to him was this is a case of a relatively rare case of a young working class African American who has a significant archival presence. Even though there are holes in his story, he still has a much more significant archival presence than a lot of people in similar circumstances at this time. Yet as these things do, my project changed a lot when I sat down to actually write. As I sat down to actually write, I became fascinated not only with Henry's life, but also some of the other people who intersected with the island. There was a photographer who risked and lost everything trying to claim Navassa for himself. The Coopers, the father and son team, who stole the island, navigated the early years after the American Revolution, and then bet on themselves and that the US government would back their claims to Navassa. There's a guy named John Hogarth, a committed abolitionist who immigrated to Haiti in the 1820s or early 1830s. In 1857, by this time he's an officer in the Haitian military. The Haitian military dispatched him to Navassa to try to stop the Coopers from stealing the islands. I have records from Haiti's commercial agents, men like Benjamin C. Clark. I excerpted one of his letters at the beginning of this presentation. Contrary to most white men in their era, Clark and some of these commercial agents actually held Haiti and its people in really high regards and exhausted really all means that they had in trying to convince the US government to block the Coopers' theft in the 1850s. I have stories of entrepreneurs, a poet that wrote a long-form poem about the voyages that he took to Navassa in the 1870s on the company's ship, the Brig Romance. I have stories of a physician who spoke of the horrors of Navassa in the 1890s. And I find all of these people to be fascinating on their own terms. They think they led really fascinating lives, but they also give us access to understanding kind of the inner workings of capitalism at this moment, imperialism. They give us an understanding, a really on-the-ground understanding of the moment where the US gets its first imperial territory at this time. But in particular, I'm excited about another young African-American man by the name of Jeff Davis, who also worked Navassa. So Jeff Davis, I've known about probably as long as I've known about Henry Jones. Davis was not on Navassa in 1889, but after the violence took place, he spoke out after the violence. He had been on the island in 1881 and 1882, where he had experienced mistreatment at the hands of company personnel. And so this is the article that gets, in September of 1889, Jeff Davis speaks to the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, who files a rather long story about him. The story gets picked up in other newspapers and reprinted in other newspapers throughout the United States at this time. Like when I found his story, I was thrilled. There were not a lot of stories of African Americans and their point of view of what it was like working on the island, but I really thought his story would end there. I would use this one letter and that would be it for him. But digitization has been a wonderful thing, and as more newspapers have been digitized, I got lucky. What would have been a literal needle in a haystack turned out to be a boon in regards to Jeff Davis, because he is all over the Wheeling newspapers. And the problem is kind of digging through his stories and separating him from his father, who also will take the same name I'll talk about in just a second, but also the ex-Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who shows up more often in these stories. So Davis is all over the Wheeling newspapers, and he was not exactly who he said he was in this newspaper stories. So who is this guy? He's actually not born Jeff Davis. He's born Frederick Davis on March 8th of 1865. He's the first of three boys born to Lewis and Virginia Davis. As best I can tell, the Davis family was born free. Certainly on the mother's side, they were free. Lewis, Jeff's father, worked as a laborer and a whitewasher. Virginia and her mother, Martha Morris, kept house in a multi-generational household that also included Virginia's father and Martha's husband, Charles Morris, who worked as a barber at the time. The family grows up alongside Wheeling, West Virginia, which was a growing city that had approximately 30,000 people by 1880. In Wheeling, Lewis, Frederick's father, is going to lay the groundwork for the younger Davis. Lewis became what, in the parlance of the times, was termed a known man. In other words, he became notorious to the police, and thanks to the newspapers, the general public, for his various escapades. Usually, Lewis was arrested for committing petty crimes, but his stories were more complicated than that. Lewis occasionally worked for the police as an unofficial detective. In 1873, and he never explains why, Lewis changes his name to Jeff Davis. I think this was likely a provocation to white Virginia, that this young African-American man is taking the famous name of Jefferson Davis. Frederick Davis followed in his old man's footsteps, but added even more panache to his antics. Growing up, young Frederick learned the lessons imparted by his father. By 1875, he began to carve out his own notoriety. The papers delighted in telling the tales of the son of the notorious Jeff Davis. Frederick inherited the guile and daring of his father. He was adept at the dark arts of till-tapping and pickpocketing. He could handle himself in a fight, though he preferred to use his wits and intelligence to get out of hairy situations. Davis's audaciousness was complemented by his ability to escape even the most dire predicaments. Davis broke out of Wheeling's jailhouse on numerous occasions. He excelled at eluding beat cops and foot races, as you see in the story here, and hopped the rails whenever he felt the heat. So both Davises, I think, had this ability to push things as far as they could, and if they ever got into real danger, they kind of left the situation. But they never really faced dire consequences, especially as young black men in Wheeling at this time. But in the mid-1870s, Lewis, Jeff's father, passes away. And after his father passes away, Frederick pays tribute to the memory of his father by adopting the name of Jeff as well. I wish I had time to talk more about him. I find him to be a really compelling person who has a really interesting trajectory in the newspapers of the day. It's really easy, I have to say, to get lost in his escapades and forget the fact that Jeff Davis, the younger Jeff Davis, was a very young person at this time. He was somewhere between the ages of 12 and 15, depending on which point of the story that we're talking about here. And in the mid-1870s, he lost not only his father, but his mother passed away prematurely, and his grandfather, also passed away during this time. So in the early 1880s, the younger Jeff Davis attempted to go straight, at least mostly. In doing so, he ran headlong into one of the main problems facing young black men in slavery's wake. Job prospects, particularly those that paid well, were few and far between. So this is shortly before he goes to the island. Davis, and that Cincinnati article makes reference to the fact that he was a Democratic politician. He tried to run for a page position in the West Virginia House of Delegates. He had tried in numerous ways to get involved in politics, and he's always kind of kept at arm's length. Davis is allowed to nibble at the political margins, but when he actually wants a seat at the table, the doors would end up being shut in his face. Still, he tries. He operates a cigar and fruit stand during this period. Like his father, he becomes an unofficial detective for the Wheeling Police Department. And then in 1881, Davis goes to Navassa. During his time on the island, he will write numerous letters to Wheeling, which his grandmother then delivered to the local press. Davis also put the skills he honed in Wheeling to good use. In early 1882, he escaped from the island, the only confirmed escapee who lived to tell the tale. And though he had made it back to Wheeling, and so this is one of one of the letters that he wrote back home at this time in early 1882. The paper ends up publishing, I think, 5 letters that Davis writes from the island during this time. Though he had made it back to Wheeling, Navassa had left an impression on him. Later in 1882, when management attacked its workforce, some of the men on the island wrote letters to Davis so he could publicize their plight. Davis also tried to get appointed as a consular to the island. He testified in at least one trial in support of his coworkers, and he continued to fight for the pay that the company owed him. He was, in the mid-1880s, the most consistent and outspoken critic of Navassa Island, even if few people paid attention to what he had to say. Davis falls out of the story after 1889. I could talk a little bit more about him. To my knowledge, after that article in the Cincinnati newspaper, he never spoke publicly about his time on Navassa again, at least in print, prior to his death in 1896. Okay, so I've sketched out a little bit about the book, a little bit about 2 of the people that I want to write about here. And now I want to talk a little bit about the organization of the book and where I'm having a problem trying to square these 2 stories in my narrative. My project takes the 1856 Guano Islands Act as its starting point, though the legislation has been explored for its imperial implications, something that I also explore in the book, although that's not where my focus is at. Its human ramifications, in my opinion, have not been adequately explored. And this is my focus, the human part of the story. My book moves through Navassa, through U.S. courtrooms, through prisons, through cities like Baltimore and Wheeling, to show that though the Guano Islands Act was meant to apply to these remote and often uninhabitable islands, its consequences frequently washed ashore. The theft of Navassa built a multi-million-dollar corporation. It helped make the city of Baltimore the primary port for fertilizer imports. Navassa's phosphatic reserves helped revitalize fallow fields throughout the eastern United States, but they also shipped phosphates over to France and to Great Britain as well. Navassa enriched a few, but it impoverished many. And because all of this came at a severe human cost, only hinted at in previous examinations of Navassa's history. Numerous men, the large majority of them being black, were killed by company personnel, by poor nutrition, by disease, and accidents before the company ceased operations in 1898. There are rumors that the number of dead is actually in the thousands, but they exist in kind of like scattered newspapers. The company didn't keep real great records, so there's probably no way of ever verifying this. I will say, and do know, that the men received little pay. many actually owed the company money when they came back home from Navassa. So while men like the Coopers and companies like the Navassa Phosphate Company got rich from the island, for the men who actually worked on the islands, who made this possible, the experience of working there was deadly, and it oftentimes was scarring. So I'm organizing the book around many of the people whose lives were changed by Navassa. And I'm also trying to write this, I should say, with a more popular audience in mind, more narratively driven. So each of the chapters that I've drafted so far take the vantage point of somebody that came through the island. So Whitehurst was the photographer, daguerreotypist that I talked about, who lost all his money. The Coopers anchor chapter 2. John Hogarth, the Haitian immigrant, or a U.S. immigrant to Haiti, and his efforts to stop Navassa's theft, B.C. Clark. This is kind of the way I've organized the book so far. And so far it's worked for the most part, I think. But I still have a lot of work to do on the period between the 1860s and 1880s. It's a period with a relative lack of information. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to spend the rest of my time, what little I have left, with Davis and Jones, the two men that by the back half of the book, I intend to turn over most of to the narration by filtering it through their experiences on and off of the islands. And centering the lives of Davis and Jones, I'm using them also as anchors to include as much as I can about the other men's lives. So I have like probably hundreds of other sources of men that show up like once in a newspaper, once in a court case, but I don't have enough information to build out stories about them. So I'm using Jones and Davis as anchors to kind of run their stories through to make up for this scant documentation. In effect, what I'm hoping to do is create a Greek chorus of sorts with all of these workers' accounts that I've found. One of the threads that runs through the book is actually the persistence of workers on the island who repeatedly tell their tales to newspapers. They sued. They organized against the abuses that the company inflicted both upon them and on its workforce. And while I love Jefferson Davis as a witness, his discovery has complicated the chronology of just focusing on Henry's story. The two men and their respective surviving records overlap in ways that make telling a chronological story difficult, or at least I've had difficulty so far. Most of that is due to the strengths and weaknesses of the surviving documentation, along with some similarities in their story. So this gives you a sense of where they're at. So Davis goes to the island first. He's there until sometime in early 1882. It's not entirely clear when he escapes. And then Jones goes to Navassa in 1889. He's back by September after the violence, and then he's incarcerated by, that should be February of 1890, not 1889. So he's incarcerated by February of 1890. So where are their strengths and weaknesses? Davis's story provides important reporting on the early 1880s in Navassa. Without his letters, the full extent of the violence, which I was not aware of in this period when I started this project, would have otherwise not been visible. His letters document beatings, tensions between management and the workforce. Between 1881 and 1883, I learned through Davis's accounts that workers initiated their first lawsuits against the company. Unfortunately, court records have been lost. But the Baltimore Sun did write about them. The trials took place in Baltimore, and they do mention them in a series of articles. I've also located a few scattered letters about the violence in the National Archives. But before I got Davis's accounts of what was happening, they seemed like rather disconnected outbreaks of violence. Davis ties all of them together and instead allows me to understand them as one moment of horrific violence on the island in the early 1880s. But in examining his case, I have to examine labor on the island as well. And the details of things like work, and even to an extent the violence that Davis endured, are kind of vague in his accounts. And then there's Henry's story. Henry goes to Navassa 8 years after Davis. Now, as a brief aside, I'll say There are other overlaps in my story, and thus far, I've been trying to work with a limitation in mind. I'm trying to write the chapters by paying attention and only moving through the sources of what those actors knew at the time or what contemporaries would say. So like, in other words, I know about stuff that happens later on in the island. I've been trying to hold off on that information just to keep things straight for now. And that's worked for the most part because most of the people I'm writing about show up in a chapter and then kind of disappear or maybe play a supporting role later on. But with Davis and Jones, it gets more difficult. With Davis and Jones, I'm planning to use them over multiple chapters, and I've found that this limitation has been less helpful. Henry's time on Navassa, because it included that 1889 violence, is much more extensively documented. Things like the nature of work, the journey that Henry took to reach the island, which is a key part of the exploitation that the men experience on the island, are extensively documented in Henry's case. The jobs he and others performed are also much more extensively documented for Henry than they are in Davis's account. So part of that is due, and I know it's impossible to read this, but one thing is to look at the length of this article. This was in the wake of the violence in 1889. A number of newspapers sent reporters down there to document what they saw. So the reporting is a lot richer for his period. It's certainly possible that aspects on the life of life on the island that Davis and Jones experienced are similar to each other, but I just don't have the documentation in Davis's accounts to verify that. By the time I get to Henry's story, what I'm worried about is that by this time readers will have been to the island multiple times, and I think waiting until 1889 to tell his story in the way that I initially set out to do might feel like a weird or even jarring step back into something that feels like that should have come sooner. So I hope I'm being clear about this and where I'm struggling. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, but thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to any thoughts and comments that you may have.
All right, thank you very much. Fascinating. I'm sure we've got lots to talk about. Anybody in the room want to kick us off with a question? I'm going to keep hold of this mic myself and rely on you all to pass this mic around to whoever's asking a question. Anyone want to get started? Okay. Andy, there you go.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. What a fascinating and really rich case. I'm excited for this book.
Thank you.
So I'm curious about if you could just for the goal of trying to solve this narrative problem, could you give a little bit more information on how you're structuring the chapters or how you're envisioning writing them? Because you mentioned at one point that you're imagining this as more of like reaching a popular audience, I think.
Yeah.
So like, is it good? Do you have a contract with like a trade press? Or are you thinking about publishing it with a trade press?
Yeah, I'm certainly considering it. I haven't talked to any presses yet, but I'm going in April to the organization American Historians to meet with academic presses at the time to begin talking about it.
Cool.
But did you have other?
Well, I don't know how useful this is, but like one thing that I was reminded of just kind of by the way that you were structuring the book and kind of the problems with narrative and perspective that you're trying to reconcile is, have you read the novel Trust by Hernan Diaz? It won the Pulitzer Prize a couple years ago, and it like really fascinating book, but it like tells the same story several different times through different lenses, and you got kind of like several unreliable narrators, and plays a lot with form and at the same time. And I wonder like if there's a way you could have little vignettes at the beginning of the chapter, like not necessarily like a first person narrative from the perspective of the subject, but kind of more inhabiting like taking some liberties and trying to tell it from a narrative point of view, and then they could kind of like overlap a little bit more freely and pop up in each other's little vignettes. So you get this kind of contested story of the island. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that recommendation. I haven't read Trust, but I'll definitely check that out. It sounds like it would be really helpful. To answer your first question, and thanks for the question as well. So in addition to kind of centering people's lives, I'm trying to write shorter chapters here that do kind of are episodic in nature, and that's somewhat the nature of the archival source or source base that I'm using. And some of it, I'm kind of tired of reading super long chapters in academic books, and I've been really enjoying a lot of these narrative books that have employed shorter chapters. And there is, I haven't gotten to this part of writing yet. I've been focusing on the first part of the book, but I'm rapidly approaching the time that I need to make sense of these stories. And there is definitely some unreliable narration that's going on in this. So, I'm open to a number of different things. So I would be, I'll definitely check out Trust. It sounds like a really, interesting source. So thank you.
Anyone in Zoom land? Let's give them a chance. No? Okay, we can stick in the room. Thanks.
I think something that is really interesting, I don't know if this will help with your narrative conundrum, but like how violence makes people pay attention. So almost like having the lack of information about Jeff Davis's life and how a lot of this information about what was happening on the island only came forth after white people were killed is really interesting. And I think also like kind of along that line, like having all these newspaper stories about Jeff Davis committing crimes and stuff is like just what information we have and like why we have that. I don't know if that helps at all, but
no, I think it does help, and it's one of the things, of course, that I've been wrestling with is that. So Henry, I do have things that were written from his hand, like he wrote a number of letters while he was incarcerated. But for Davis, everything I have is filtered through these newspapers. So it's one of the concerns I have. I'm very much getting a white hostile newspaper's understanding of who he was in the 1870s and 1880s. The only thing I have written from his hand are the letters that the newspapers publish. But I have evidence that the newspapers doctored some of his writing. So, for instance, in the article that was published in 1889 after the violence, it quotes a letter that he wrote in 1882, but it put it in dialect. The original letter is not in dialect, so like working through that has been really tough. But I like your point, and I think you're right about the violence, and it's a slow kind of realization that papers make because Davis and the people that were on the island in 1882 are documenting events that may have been as horrific, if not more, than the 1889 violence. But because no white guys were killed in it, their accounts are more or less dismissed and ignored. The 1889 violence happens, and they're everywhere. It's like Caribbean papers are covering it, European papers are covering it, U.S. papers are covering it. So it is helpful. So thank you, Blake.
Yeah, because I think even if you are not totally set on telling everything narratively, that it could actually be really powerful to tell the story about Henry Clay first and have all of this information, and then to have like the next chapter or a further chapter go back and be like, well, these things were in newspapers before, like these documentation of these terrible things that were happening, but it didn't really get that much like press because of this. So that also can have like a really powerful interaction. I think could like elicit feelings in the reader of like really being like, well, why wasn't anybody paying attention? It's like, oh, well, here's why.
No, I take your point, and it's something I've like toyed with using Davis to do flashbacks. I think my biggest concern with that is that I lose some of what makes him such a compelling figure, I think, but I could probably try to figure out a better way to do that. So
That was a great talk, Dr. Halpin. I'm wondering, in trying to figure out how to solve the narrative issues, do you know where the guano on the island was being imported to, other than for like manufacturing?
Yeah,
Where would it end up? You know.
yeah, so I'm like right now I'm writing an article that tries to trace where this is going to, and so primarily especially in the early period, it's going through the port of Baltimore, and then it's being so Baltimore not only has the port infrastructure for the to handle the phosphates, but there's also a number of like ancillary industries, other fertilizer mixing plants and whatnot that are created in Baltimore to handle the phosphatic trade. As time goes on, it gets a little bit more dispersed. There's, and I haven't figured out the exact connection yet because I haven't gotten to this part of the story, but there's a town on the coast of North Carolina that's called Navassa, and it's named for the island. There also is a fertilizer manufactory there as well that is taking some of the phosphates by the 1880s and 1890s. So yeah, I'm trying to figure that out, but it's getting brought into Baltimore. Sometimes it's being sold as is. It's being ground and then sold as just Navassa phosphates. Davis's letter, because the company prohibited letters coming on and off the island, he stuffed his letter into a barrel of phosphates, and it ended up in some farm in Iowa, and that farmer then forwarded it on to his grandmother. So yeah, it's some of it's getting ground and sold to farmers directly, but most of it is getting, it seems anyways, is getting sent to these other fertilizer manufactories and then being made into superphosphates or into manipulated guano that's being sold mail order through like American Farmer and newspapers. There's also, the last thing I'll say is like, they contracted with agents that would sell, so like, if you look up Navassa and like in newspapers.com, you'll get like dealers that are selling it in Norfolk and Richmond and New Orleans and various other places as well.
I guess I'm wondering too, like if the demand for guano is connected to plantation agriculture, and I wonder if that could be something you could connect with Jeff Davis's story or Henry Jones's story if they had enslaved ancestors.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. So, I don't think Davis was enslaved. There's possible that some of his family members were, but his grandfather shows up in a 1853 petition to stay in West Virginia, or Virginia at the time, to stay in Virginia as a free black man. I haven't found a lot of stuff about his father's side beyond his father. Henry, I suspect, was enslaved. Pocomoke City and the eastern shore of Maryland is where slavery was in Maryland. The problem is I have not been able to trace back anything beyond the 1870 census for his family. But yeah, I do think, right, there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between these plantations that are exhausting their fields and then using these phosphates and guano to revitalize them. And so, right, what Davis and what Jones are doing are helping revitalize these fields that have roots certainly in the days of slavery and plantations.
So we have a question on Zoom from Phil Yard. Phil, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hey, Dennis. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm really excited for the book. This is just a small observation in connection to the last question. I know that you said that one of the challenges that you've been facing is that you have this kind of repetitive narrative of people going back to the island over and over again. But it struck me that one, and this is just kind of obvious connections, that I forget if it was Jeff or Henry that you said grew up in Baltimore in the Reconstruction period.
Yeah.
But given that you just mentioned that a lot of guano is being imported to the Port of Baltimore in particular, it seems like one nice narrative setup for that chapter is to emphasize, like, here's where all these resources are going. And then here's one of our main characters who's growing up at this time and then heads to Navassa from Baltimore. So that just seems like one small connection that might be useful for the narrative.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I agree. And I've been trying. So one of the things that I got really lucky in that Again, so especially for the 1850s and 1860s, I just don't know a lot of the people's names that went to the island. The company didn't, it kept records in the 1860s, but they never really record the names of the workers. They just record them on essentially like a 19th century Excel sheet, and what they were doing on the island. But yeah, so I did get lucky in that I do know the first 13 guys that went to the island because at the time the Baltimore Port authorities did not recognize Navassa as being part of the United States, so they treated the ship as it was arriving from a foreign port of call. And through that, I got lucky in that one of the guys has extensive documentation, especially later on in his life. So I've been trying to use that to make the connections that you're talking about there. But yeah, Baltimore, I very much want Baltimore to be part of this story, and I do think it's important that Jones grew up in there, both for the fertilizer, but also Baltimore's place in Reconstruction following the Civil War. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you. A great talk as well. I know there was a suggestion earlier about kind of vignettes or little narratives that could open up chapters, and if you were to go with that approach, I mean, I think one that could work well as an opening to a chapter is what you just mentioned, the letter from Fred Davis just being found in a barrel of phosphate by an Iowa farmer. That's certainly a way to open a chapter. Is there, like, how much do you know about that specific incident with it just being found and being able to get back to, grandmother in a different state? And would you actually be able to use that to introduce Davis possibly?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that would work based on your structure of chapters, but
Yeah, so to answer your question, I don't know a ton about how the letter ended up there. I know that he stuffed it into a barrel of phosphate, but I also, and this is where I'm trying to draw on some of the other workers, he was not the only worker to try to smuggle a letter off of the island. So I talk about other attempts by people to smuggle the letter off of the island. The way I've been treating that letter as well, and especially Davis and also Martha Morris, Davis's grandmother, is part in the story. I'm thinking about it in the context of who he was and what he was doing, right? So this is a person that knew by the time he went to Navassa that anything he did was going to get coverage in the newspapers. He's like in there on a weekly basis, right? And so he sends this letter home. His grandmother, who was raising him by this point, and also was the mother of his father, Lewis, who was doing a lot of the same things, certainly knows that the Davis name is going to attract attention. And I don't think it's any accident. Like, once that letter makes it back to Martha Morris, his grandmother, she knew exactly what to do with it. She walks down to the newspapers and publishes it, and sure enough, they follow suit. So yeah, I do think I've been trying to make hay with that process by thinking about what I know about the path that the letter took, but also about the context of when he wrote it and what his grandmother would do with the letter. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Nate.
I have a question about the bigger picture that you mentioned a few times, and part of what makes this so intriguing is the connections between these fascinating individuals and the really big picture of capitalism and imperialism and maybe other isms as well.
Yeah.
How prominent do you see that as being in the book? I know you said you want it to be narrative, but is it going to be the kind of story that's really looking towards those big concepts?
Yeah, I do want it to be a part of the book. I'm hoping to find a way to not be as ham-fisted and be like, this book argues this, and this in terms of imperialism and capitalism, but rather kind of show the effects that this is having on people. Like, I mean, this is, a lotto ticket for the Coopers. I luckily, I have their probate records and know how much they ended up selling the island for. I know about the company's money off it. So I want to be able to demonstrate through their lives kind of the different effects that they had for working on this island and gesture and make arguments towards capitalism, imperialism, but also labor and race at this time. but I want to avoid some of the jargony language for sure, and some of the academic, I think, efforts to over-explain things. It's, I mean, as I found out, it's really difficult to do that too. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I always feel though that kind of move makes a book so much more valuable if it's like,
Yeah.
I loved reading this book, the stories in it, but now I understand something really big a little bit
Yeah.
better. So that, to the extent that you can do that, I think that's great.
Yeah, and like, I think of, I don't think the students will be surprised at all by this, but I've been very influenced by writers like Taya Miles and Marissa Fuentes, but also like the book that you all are reading this week for Dr. Keachel's class, the Greg Grandin book, Empire of Necessity, that tells this huge story, and it's a complicated story about slavery and race and capitalism that's told through these lives, and it's done in such a really smart, and it's a sophisticated book, but it's also a book that you can, I think that most people could pick up and at least follow most of it, even if you get lost a little bit in some of the details. But
Anybody want one final question? Anyone on Zoom? All right, well then I think we can wrap it up. But thank you so much to everyone for coming along. Thanks for the questions and the conversation. Hope to see you next time. Next week we've got David Breedenkamp from SPEAR. His title is going to be Frontline Narrative Inquiry. So same time, same place next week. Hope to see you here. And in the meantime, let's give a big thanks to Dennis for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you everyone on Zoom as well. Yeah, thanks, Paul. I appreciate it.
Have you ever read an older book?
Test.
Oh yeah, yeah. I
was thinking of that a little bit.
Yeah.
Earlier phase of American
Yeah.
capitalism.